an action-packed day planned. As usual, I've planned for about a day and a half of material in a day, so we'll be moving rather quickly. I want to share with you the overview, an outline of today, and have you take a look at it. What we have planned for the morning is to review and identify the concept of the metaphorical construction of reality, what that means, and two aspects of it, the metaphorical construction of personal reality and the metaphorical construction of interpersonal or social reality. And our focus today will be particularly on one aspect of that, and that is the family and the metaphorical construction of family reality. Then we'll talk about these ideas in relationship to the focus of today's workshop. What is psychotherapy in the metaphorical domain, and how does it work? Does it work? What does it do? And after a brief introduction of those ideas, we'll move on to looking at metaphor, the nature of metaphor. And there are many places, and some of you may be familiar here and there with people in the field that talk about metaphor. Metaphor pops up in a lot of different places, including that was a metaphor. One of the things we're going to do today is introduce you and sensitize you to listening for metaphors and hearing them when they occur. And they occur all over the place, including that one. So we've got to start tuning in to metaphors, which is also a metaphor. It can drive you crazy to do this, which is also a metaphor, but you get the idea. So we'll define metaphor, and the concept of metaphor is very important theoretically, it is very important therapeutically. We'll then look at some clinical examples of metaphor, and I'll encourage you to write down some of your own, either from your own experience personally or from clients that you work with, preferably clients that you work with. Then another focus, there are kind of three main foci, I suppose, to this workshop. One is in what way does the metaphorical construction of reality and that concept as an idea, as a way of understanding, help us to understand ways in which otherwise quite different approaches to psychotherapy are quite similar? Or how can we compare different approaches to psychotherapy in such a way that we can see similarities as well as differences amongst them, but particularly to move toward an integration of different approaches to psychotherapy. So one of the theoretical emphases today will be to entertain some ideas about how psychotherapy can be integrated through the eyes of metaphor, looking at psychotherapy as a metaphorical endeavor. And we will review psychodynamic theories, both psychoanalysis and also some more recent work in psychodynamic theories. We'll review cognitive behavioral therapy and discuss that. We will review family therapy. We'll review Adlerian psychology and look at each of those perspectives from the standpoint of metaphor and the metaphorical construction of reality, and psychotherapy in the metaphorical domain, looking for connections and ways and patterns that exist in those approaches related to metaphor. Then we will look at the metaphorical construction of reality in practice, and we'll look at two kind of action interventions. One is called entering the metaphorical domain, what that is and how you do it, the different steps in that that's involved in that. And the second is transforming the metaphor, what that is, why it's crucial. But the premise here is the main kind of base on which all this is grounded is that we construct our reality metaphorically. That means that everything we do, everything we feel, everything we think, everything we believe is based on a kind of substrata of metaphorical thinking and metaphorical reality, which occurs outside the level of awareness. Now, the idea of metaphorical construction of reality, which in your notes and as we talk, we'll be calling MCR theory, practice, MCR for the metaphorical construction of reality, I invite you to think of this not as a kind of new school of therapy, because it isn't. It's not complete enough to be a school of therapy or even an approach to therapy as, for example, Adlerian psychology is. What it is a dimension in therapy, a process that occurs in therapy that I'm trying to explicate more specifically, and also the mechanisms through which different therapies work, even though the different therapies are very different. And what I'm going to suggest is that the mechanisms working at work in psychoanalytic and psychodynamic therapy, in family therapy and Adlerian therapy, are blatantly and directly metaphorical. And I'm going to try and prove that through the integration discussion that we'll have today. So that's the first thing. One of the implications is that if you don't understand, or more importantly, if you don't help the person you are working with become aware of and influence their metaphorical construction of reality, then the kinds of changes you'll try to achieve will be either short-lived or long in coming. Let's talk about what psychotherapy in the metaphorical domain is not. What we're not focusing on today, and in fact, what we'll be suggesting is very different. Anytime in any approach to therapy, whatever orientation you're using, that you offer an interpretation about behavior that's based on a theoretical conceptualization of that behavior from the theory that you're using, you're not doing metaphorical therapy in the way that we're talking about. Now, there's a sense in which you are doing metaphorical therapy because all theories are metaphors. It's a different way of thinking about theory. When we look at the definitions of metaphor, I think you'll see that. Because a theory isn't real. It's an as-if. And the concepts, nobody ever actually saw a lifestyle or a lifestyle goal. They're constructs. It is as if we have them. The same thing for Oedipal complexes and other stuff. They're all analogies, as-ifs. They're useful ways of understanding, but they're not the thing that we are trying to understand. And where we begin to have difficulty as therapists is when we take our theories as true, and even worse, the only truth, rather than a version of the truth. And there's a truth within theory. Theories are consistent, and there's a truth once you accept the assumptions of the theory. But it doesn't mean that that's the only truth. It can't mean it's the only truth. And you can't prove it. You can't prove a theory true, because it's a theory. You can only say that certain observations are consistent with it. One of the other implications of this, by the way, is that the way I like to put it is your theory, your favorite, we all have a particular favorite, probably mostly in this room, which is Adler, but I could be talking to a group of classical Freudians. It wouldn't make any difference. The statement would still be the same. And that is that your theory, in order for your theory to be right, other theories don't have to be wrong. And it's a mistake that I think happens a lot in the field, that in order to show that your theory has a truth to it, you need to show that other theories don't. And you can't show that. It's not an interesting thing for Adlerians when we do that. When we think or say Adlerian psychology is better, we're being neurotic from our own definition, because we're striving for superiority by using our theory as being better, above others. Interesting thought. Anyway, so interpretations based on theory are not metaphorical. I'll tell you what they are later on, but they're not metaphorical. So that's one idea. Second is taking cognitive therapy and Adlerian psychology. Most of the ways in which we formulate lifestyle that are closer to kind of the idiosyncratic characteristics of the person have to do with the person's beliefs, basic assumptions, self-life and others, if-then statements, etc. When we are doing that kind of work and helping people to understand their lifestyle in that format, we also are not doing metaphorical therapy. And one of the things that is central to the idea of doing therapy in the metaphorical domain is you cannot, must not, should not, we don't do should, could not, if you mix these other forms of interpretive therapy with metaphorical therapy, then you're not doing metaphorical therapy and it doesn't work in the way that it's designed to. And as we go through the day and look at the difference between particularly imaginal thinking and something called syllogistic thinking, you will see why that's true. And as we look at the clinical examples, you'll see that. Metaphor is derived from the Greek word meta and phoreme. And one of the things interesting is that meta in Greek means over, and phoreme in Greek means to carry or to bear. So metaphor means to carry or bear meaning from one thing to another. Let's take a metaphor that somebody might use in describing their problem. Let's say I feel like I'm hitting my head up against a wall. That's one that many people use. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that that's actually a simile rather than a metaphor for those of you who are technically oriented. Because if it has the word like in it, that's actually a simile. But if I just said, I'm hitting my head up against a wall, then that would be a metaphor. Well, for our purposes, it doesn't matter, because the process, the structure is still the same. So for our purposes, simile and metaphor are equivalent. Now, if I am saying I feel like I'm hitting my head up against a wall, why do I say that? Why in the world would I create that phrase? Well, I'm trying to communicate to the person that I'm talking with. And I'm finding at that point that literal description of the actual situation isn't enough. I want to give another kind of level of understanding. I'm not thinking about this, it happens just quite spontaneously. And metaphor is a way of doing that. Metaphor is very evocative. It is non-logical. It is analogical. We will talk more about that distinction later. But when I say I'm hitting my head up against a wall, first of all, that's not true. Metaphors are generally false, logically or literally, because I'm not actually hitting my head up against a wall. Tomorrow, when Fran Wilson talks about metaphors and Adlerian psychology and working with schizophrenia, that might not be the case in some cases. That will actually be, I'm hitting my head up against the wall, and they mean that's what they're doing. But today we're talking as if. It is as if it is as if I were hitting my head up against an actual wall. But it's not actually true. That's, by the way, the reason why metaphors were not only not of interest in philosophy and psychology for many, many years, but in fact were rejected as fantasy. And under the influence of objectivism and positivism, people were not interested in metaphors because they were blatantly not true and should be gotten rid of. There are many people who thought that they just should be eliminated from the English language. So the meaning that's carried over is an analogical meaning. It is an analogy. That when I say, I feel like I'm hitting my head up against a wall, there is no wall. I'm not actually hitting my head up against. But the situation that I'm describing, in whatever that situation is, it is as if I were. And this is how it feels. It feels as if I were hitting my head up against a wall. So the meaning in the metaphorical image, which is hitting one's head up against a wall, that's the metaphorical image. The meaning in that is carried over to the actual situation that the person is describing. when they come up with that metaphor, when the metaphor maker creates that metaphor. Okay? So that's what we mean by carrying over meaning from one place to another. We'll have a lot more examples of those in a minute. Giving a thing a name that belongs to something else is another way that metaphor is discussed. Creating a resemblance between two different things is another way, and that's important. Because hitting my head up against the wall and the situation that I'm describing, let's say I'm frustrated, I'm writing a paper, and I'm experiencing a block. And every time I try it, I get blocked again. So I say, I'm hitting my head up against the wall every time I sit down and write this paper. We're doing more than just comparing two things. We are saying that two different things actually resemble each other, even though they're different. That the situation of writing and not being able to write and hitting my head up against the wall, which are totally different, resemble each other. That means that we are integrating when we do that. We are creating a third thing. Metaphors are very special in that way, and it's the only form of language and the only form of thought that does this. It takes two different things, identifies a resemblance between them, and describes them as an as-if statement that there is as if they were similar. The other thing about metaphor that will be crucial in terms of metaphor in therapy is that it is an example of the creativity of the individual. Because when a person speaks a metaphor, they are creating meaning. Do you see that? Do you experience that? When a person describes literal information, it is not as creative. And you will find that if you attend to the metaphors and the metaphorical images and then do what we're going to describe as exploring and transforming them, that you enable the person to move into a very deeply experiential and visual modality of thought. And that's the focus, and that's also why it's different. Because psychotherapy in the metaphorical domain is psychotherapy in the domain of imagery. But it's not just imagery. See, there are people who have talked about imagery and teach imagery. Imagery is a part of metaphor. But imagery can exist apart from metaphor. You can just have images. But when you explore an image that is a part of a metaphor that a client has created, you're exploring an image that they used to identify their, what I call, metaphorical construction of reality of a situation. And when you move into that image, then you're moving into a very special form of imaginal thinking. And I believe, based on the things that I've read, that is the fundamental way in which we create reality. And when we do that, we are not leaving reality, the situation that's being discussed. In fact, we're entering what is truly real for the person, subjectively and phenomenologically. For those of you Adlerians, we are entering into the nature of lifestyle, and I'm going to make the argument that a lifestyle is fundamentally metaphorical more than it is a statement of private logic. It's a statement of private analogic. It's closer to the truth of the metaphor, the reality of lifestyle. Patterns are metaphorical. They are analogical. They are simultaneous. And most important, they are imaginal. Not necessarily visual, but they're imaginal. Patterns aren't identified very much by logical deduction and by sequential thought. And Adlerian psychology requires, if you're formulating a lifestyle, it requires actually a movement from thinking in patterns, which is thinking in images, and thinking metaphorically, and then formulating the deductive propositions based on that thinking process. But I don't think anybody talks about that. And that's why, at least for me, I think it's very frustrating to hear the outcome and not know where it went. And that's because there's a mode of thinking that's missing, a mode of processing, of taking in. I will call that today listening with the third eye. Some of you may be familiar with Reich's Listening with the Third Ear. It was a major book early in the development of psychoanalysis. And listening with the third eye is what metaphor is all about, and also highlights another interesting and unique feature of metaphor in our language and in our thought, and that is that metaphors are spoken, so they're words. And since they're spoken, they're conscious. And since they're conscious, they occur in the flow of logical speech. So we hear the speech. So we listen through our ears. But because metaphors are images, we process them imaginally. Although most of the time we don't attend to the image meaning of the metaphor. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to point out and teach you today, is how to listen with your mind's eye rather than your mind's logic. And it's very different. Some people even think that you're using a different side of the brain to do it. There's some debate over that, but certainly the processes, whether it occurs in this hemisphere or that hemisphere or all around, the processes are very different. The process of deductive logic is very different from the process of imagination. And through the day, we'll be weaving back and forth, so to speak, in that area. Okay, so let's go to some clinical examples of metaphor. I'd like you to read that page. And then at the bottom of the page, I would like you to add one or two from your client's experience, if you see clients. A client, in other words, describe in a sentence like what I've done here, nature of the person, and then a metaphor that they use, or that they've used. It can be a metaphor they use frequently, or a metaphor they use once that you can recall. If you can't recall a metaphor that a client used, or you don't have any clients, then write down a metaphor that you use from time to time. So read these and then add one or two. Okay, let's hear some examples real quick. Yes?
I'm on a tightrope.
I'm on a tightrope. What was the situation that was referring to quickly?
He was just talking about feeling uncomfortable. People were watching him all the time.
Okay. Another one? That's a good one. Yes? Yes?
Woman saying, wife, I feel like we're really stuck.
I feel like we're really stuck. Yes. That's a common one. You'll notice that some of the metaphors will be more unique than others. But however, when you begin exploring the metaphors that are common, like stuck, you'll find that they become unique as you begin to explore them. The person's unique creativity emerges. Yes?
I feel like somebody punched me in the gut.
Feel like somebody punched me in the gut, right? Good. Yes?
Like a fish out of water.
A fish out of water. All of those are common. The last example that I have down here on the bottom, a man diagnosed as alcoholic complains that his wife is not doing things she has agreed to. When the therapist asks, which was me, asked if he has talked to his wife about his feelings, he replies, I don't want to open up a can of worms. Now, see, most of the time, I think, in therapy, what we do next is to just go into the situation. Why don't, what does that mean, actually, in terms of situation? From this perspective, we don't do that. What the person just said is what it means. The actual situation is just an expression of his metaphorical reality. It's the metaphorical reality that you want to get to. And he just told you what that is. He doesn't want to open up a can of worms. And so he explored that. Now, I'll tell you briefly how I worked with that. We'll talk about different methods of working. But with that one, I said, when you say a can of worms, I get an image of a can of worms inside your stomach. And the worms are eating away at you. I wanted him not to like this image of worms, and to reframe it so that opening it up would be better than keeping it closed. And if you open it up, worms can get out. You might even be able to do some fishing. And toward the end of that session, I thought of another association and said, I'd rather you open up a can of worms than a can of beer. So it's another way of talking metaphorically to people. And as we go through the theory, I'll give you some rationales for why this mode of communication seems to be very powerful. Now, intuitively, you may experience it as powerful, and certainly the experiential element is one of the reasons it's powerful. But there are also some theoretical reasons why it's powerful. The other thing that's important to note is that, we'll talk about this too, but metaphor is the main language of poetry, isn't it? It's the primary language of poetry. Why? Because it is so evocative. You can think of this approach as the poetics of psychotherapy. Because when you do this kind of work, you have the experience of creating and experience of the client creating. And psychotherapy is always fresh and always new. And some of my students like to say, or come in and say, I never knew psychotherapy could be so much fun. Because it becomes very spontaneous when you do this kind of work. The other thing, by the way, that people find when they begin doing this kind of work, in addition to it being fun, is that therapy often moves more rapidly in terms of progress. And the other thing that students say is, you know, I used to be interested in poetry. I used to be interested in art. I used to be interested in what else? I used to be interested in literature, sculpture, some creative things, music. And I left that at the door when I came into CSPP. But when they come into this class, one of my texts, I'll talk a little bit about it later, is Betty Edwards' Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. Now, what is a text on drawing on the right side of the brain doing in a class in psychotherapy? Well, it's doing a lot, because what that trains you to do, it's one of the things that trains you to attend to what your mind is seeing directly and draw it, rather than drawing what you think you know, which is what people do, and it's why you're not good artists. But if you go through that book and do the exercises, you discover that you can be a heck of a... I mean, you look at the board for before and after pictures in that book, and they're amazing. And almost anybody can do it. But it also helps in this process of learning to do this kind of therapy. My favorites are Metaphor is the Dream Work of Language, which is quite appropriate because there's an analogy between the metaphorical image and dreams. We will talk about that when we talk about the psychodynamic point of view. And Aristotle's definition, Aristotle was first interested in metaphors. He thought that metaphor was very important. He said that metaphor is genius. Only genius can create a metaphor. He was thinking of poet. He did that in his book on poetics. But in some ways, I think that's true of every human being. Whenever we create a metaphor, we are acting ingeniously with regard to our own uniqueness. And when Adler said that neurosis is testimony to man's creativity, my favorite quote from Adler, he's right. And when we think about it, we all are, I believe, true geniuses in the way that we maintain our lifestyle in the face of all kinds of evidence to the contrary. And we don't even have to think about it. It's an amazing kind of creativity that we can deny information that conflicts with how we feel, find all kinds of rationalizations, and we're not even aware that they're rationalizations, and manage to find people who continually treat us the same so that we can continue to have the same points of view about them and think that that's true for everybody, and, or it's not true for everybody, but in any case it's true for us. And it's an act of genius to do that. It's amazing how we do it. Now, the main thing here in terms of novelty and change, and it's true also in linguistics, metaphor is the part of language that enables us to grasp something new because that's the way new knowledge occurs. It occurs through analogy, through something we're familiar with, and looking at something that we're not familiar with, and bridging that. And it's that true verbally, and it's true in terms of understanding. We'll talk more about that later in terms of language and creativity and change, but the point that I want to make is that metaphor is the language of change, and so if we're interested, as we are in psychotherapy, in promoting change, then we should be interested in talking metaphorically and working in the metaphorical domain and helping our clients get in touch with, experience, develop, explore, and change their metaphors. Moving right along, the psychotherapy integration through the eyes of metaphor. Part 1. We've got 4 parts. Part 1 is psychodynamic psychotherapy in the metaphorical domain. What that means is psychodynamic psychotherapy is a broad concept. Basically, it means any theory that has a theory of unconscious motivation, the psychodynamic theory. So Adler would be considered psychodynamic theory. Freud, of course, was considered the first, though he wasn't actually the first. Pierre Genet and others also had theories similar, or also a theory of unconscious. By the way, if you want to do have a wonderful treat for yourself and you're interested in theory, one of the best books on this topic is called The Discovery of the Unconscious. And it's by a Canadian guy, actually. And it's Henry, with an I, Ellenberger. It's not by Ellen Berger. Some of my students have looked for Berger in a book, and it starts with an E, Ellenberger. One more. Henry Ellenberger. Discovery of the Unconscious. Freud appears in about the 4th, 5th chapter of the book. He talks about all the precursors to Freud, including Pierre Genet. And he has a wonderful chapter on Adler, including a historical description of Adler, and I think the single best work on Adler that exists in the literature by a non-Adlerian. So metaphor combines and bridges pictorial thinking in imagery and logical thinking, which in psychoanalytic terms is described as unconscious primary process and unconscious secondary process. So metaphors are very special from a psychoanalytic point of view. They're not like dreams, which are all primary process, considered all primary process to seem off, but they are a bridging of the two, the interface of the two. Second thing that's important about this is that to note is that sensory imagery is present at birth. If we think about it, I think this is interesting. When I looked at the developmental literature in cognitive development and looked at the development of language, the development of concepts, it becomes quite obvious that if personality, whether from a psychoanalytic point of view or a Adlerian point of view, personality is formed in the early years of life. And object relations theory even thinks it's formed in the first few years of life, first 24 to 36 months. But in any case, if it's formed, Adler said that lifestyle stabilizes, becomes, quote, relatively fixed at about age 5. It becomes clear that if you compare the amount of information that would be relevant to lifestyle that's based on language to the amount of information that would be relative to the development of lifestyle based on sensory imagery, tactile imagery, so we're using imagery in a broad sense, not just visual. It's clear that lifestyle is formed based on non-linguistic formulations. Because of that, working in the metaphorical domain, that's one of the arguments that I said I was going to make. Or putting it another way, working with a representation of lifestyle in imaginal cognition, in contrast to logical, or what we'll call syllogistic cognition, is closer to the way lifestyle actually developed. Closer to the experience of the person, closer to the images that the person was experiencing at the time they formulated the lifestyle, and in fact lifestyle is an image, and lifestyle is a metaphor, and Adler usually talks about lifestyle as metaphors, so do Adlerians. But when we formulate them logically. One of the things I want to point out is that's very different. You're not working in the same way when you're working logically, deductively, as Adlerians often do, and as cognitive therapists always do. And contrast that to working imaginally with metaphors, and it's very different. And as we go through this, I want you to kind of attend to that difference And so one of the things it's the way in which I mean this is a dimension of therapy. I'm going to, I hope, one of my goals is that you will leave here doing much more powerful Adlerian therapy if you're an Adlerian, doing much more powerful psychoanalytic therapy if you're a psychoanalyst. And the same for any other approach. The only two approaches that really are not consistent with this is behaviorism and classical psychoanalysis, in which you are not allowed to break therapist neutrality, which means you don't say anything. So if you're constrained from saying anything, this approach doesn't work for you. And if your goal is to modify behavior, this approach is not helpful, not consistent with that. Imaged, that is metaphorical communication, makes contact through the defensive layer of repression. That is another statement from the psychoanalytic literature, that we find and see that when people get into their metaphors and metaphorical communication, it seems to bypass the defensive processes, what an Adlerian psychology would call safeguard mechanisms. Now, I'll read a transcript later on that will demonstrate this. The next two items are quotes from Bruno Bettelheim, and they are from a fascinating book, which actually Brad Wilson introduced me to, called Freud and Man's Soul. A little small book, and it really, for any psychotherapist who thinks that they're interested in or thinks that they do psychodynamic psychotherapy, and for any Adlerian therapist, that ought to be required reading. It is a different way of looking at Freud. And it makes the point that Freud in English is very different from Freud in German. And basically it's Bettelheim's thesis that the physicians, psychiatrists who translated Freud, butchered him and created an analytic theory that was not what Freud intended, and not the essence of Freud. Now, some people say, well, why didn't Freud object? And he didn't object very much, and there are all kinds of debates over that. Bettelheim and others feel like one of the reasons is he never thought American psychiatry was very important compared to European psychiatry. Turned out to be wrong. But in any case, whether or not it's what Freud actually intended or not, which is debatable, it is a very useful way of an alternative way of looking at Freud. And one of the main dimensions in it is looking at the way Freud used metaphors. Looked at the language that Freud used in German. We will go into some of those examples in detail. But in looking at this, listen to how Bettelheim describes this. Because of repression or the influence of censorship, the unconscious reveals itself in symbols or metaphors. Okay? So, with all the fancy stuff about repression and all that stuff, basically the unconscious reveals itself in metaphors. Therefore, doing psychotherapy in the metaphorical domain from a psychoanalytic point of view is doing therapy with unconscious process. It's making the unconscious conscious. And what was the phrase that Freud used? Where id is, there shall ego be. How many of you heard that phrase? It's Adlerians. If there's any other group, everybody goes. They probably go like this too. But basically, he was saying that where unconscious process is, we would like conscious process to be. We would like and in the German, by the way, id is not a German word. Id has no meaning at all, actually. It's just made up. But the German word is es, es, and it stands for it. In English, translation is it. And the German word that was translated into ego is ich, I-C-H. It means I. Like I went to the store. One of the reasons Freud used these words to describe his theory, Bettelheim suggests, is that he wanted to create a theory for the common person. You sure don't get that feeling when you read Freud. But one of the reasons Bettelheim says is that while Freud wanted to create a theory for the common person, his translators, because they were doctors, and he doesn't say this, but because they studied Latin, translated it through the Latin. If you translate Freud through the Greek, you get a different English translation, as you saw with the notion of metaphor, and you'll see in a moment we'll compare the two. In any case, Then he goes on to say, in its concern, and this is where psychoanalysis goes wrong in my view, in its concern with the unconscious, psychoanalysis tries to speak about it in its own metaphorical language. I say, why not speak about it in the client's own metaphorical language? If that's the language of the client's unconscious, why create another theoretical language, metaphorical as it may be, as an external frame of reference for understanding what you already have in the first place? That's why we don't interpret in the metaphorical domain from any theory, because we already have what we need. We have the best representation of the client's unconscious process when the client speaks in metaphors. And when we explore those metaphors, we are exploring directly unconscious process at a very fundamental level, I believe, and some of the outcomes of therapy suggest that's true. Okay. Metaphors are more likely than purely intellectual statement to touch the human chord and arouse our emotions, and thus give us a feeling for what is meant. So that's true. A true comprehension of psychoanalysis requires not only an intellectual realization, but a simultaneous emotional response. Neither alone will do. Well, how about not trying to understand psychoanalysis? How about trying to understand human beings? And a true understanding of human beings requires not just intellectual realization, but an emotional response. And as Bettelheim points out, a well-chosen metaphor will permit both. But let's permit both, focusing on the person rather than on a theory. Okay? Second, because poets speak in metaphors about the content of their unconscious, Freud insisted that they, these poets, and other great artists, knew all along what he had to discover through laborious work. I think the work is less laborious and the discovery quicker and more powerful when we become poets as therapists and we attend to the poetry that our clients are creating when they speak in metaphor. And so rather than, again, looking to something outside and looking to a theory to provide the poetry, just do it in the moment with the person and yourself. So in some ways you're creating a poem when you are entering into the metaphorical domain with another person. Your experience may be different when you do this too. You may experience yourself differently. Interesting things happen. Sometimes we happen. Therapists report kind of emerging kind of experience, loss of boundary. It's a very intimate kind of way of working, very experiential closeness, and requires a great deal of that kind of sensitivity, but also enhances that kind of sensitivity. The last statement, psychotherapy in the metaphorical domain involves working directly with the unconscious, primary process thinking in relationship to a current situation or problem. We're not just looking at a dream and trying to figure out what it means. When we look at the dream work that metaphor represents, we are looking at unconscious fundamental processes, we will later call them basic lifestyle processes, that are already, because the client created them in relationship to a situation, represent the meaning of the situation. When you explore and transform that metaphor, you're working with that situation. You're also simultaneously working with the childhood sources of that image. We'll get into that word later. So it's a very powerful place in which to work. It's a little tricky to get into, and it's very tricky to stay there. But I'll show you how to do that. And some of the things, there will be times when you will work and this will be interesting and it'll kind of be neat. And you'll like what happens. There'll be times when the changes that you achieve as a result sometime out of one metaphorical intervention will be close to the goals that you have for therapy for this client. It can be really striking. I'll read some examples of that. So it doesn't happen all the time, but sometimes it does. So primary process thinking in relationship to the current situation or problem, and is therefore more likely to impact a person's unconscious process than psychotherapy in the interpretive domain, which translates the client's endogenous metaphors, as are the metaphors they use spontaneously, into a metaphoric language derived from theoretical framework external to the person. Okay, we already made that point. The main goal in psychoanalysis, as Freud practiced it, was the development of a transference neurosis, where the neurosis becomes present in the therapy. And the way that that happens is through the free associations of the client and the non-response of the therapist, who cannot even be seen while the person lies on the couch. And then the person works through the neurotic transference, and that's how the cure occurs. Relatively few people practice that way anymore, even psychoanalysts. There are other ways that they look at transference that are closer in some ways to Adlerian psychology. Now, one of the things I want to do is take a look at what transference is from a metaphorical point of view. And as I have here, we have Übertragung. What the heck is Übertragung? Well, Übertragung is Freud's term for transference. That's his German word. So when he wrote in German, he wanted to say transference. He said Übertragung. Actually, that's an inaccurate statement because he never wanted to say transference. But when he wanted to say what we call transference, he said this, Übertragung. Now, Übertragung translated through the Latin, remember that's a physician's favorite language. Got to be good for something, you studied it, so they use it for translation. Comes out as transference. However, the German, if you translate directly into English, Über means carry or bear. Sound familiar? Remember what meta means in Greek? Meta means over, and foreign means to carry or bear. The translation of Übertragung into English is not transference, but it's metaphor. The most accurate linguistic translation of Freud's term for transference. From this perspective, transference becomes metaphor. And it is a carrying over from the past, a meaning into the present. But notice when you look at that, the key factor in Adlerian psychology, a key factor in Adlerian psychology, comes into play. And that is the transference is not a passive, reactive, deterministic, historically determined, developmentally determined, biologically determined process, as it was for Freud. It is a creative process in the moment in which the person creates a resemblance between the past as remembered and the present, as if the two resembled each other. You see that? That's exactly what transference is. It's exactly what transference is. It is a creative process in the moment that an individual does. It is an as-if construction. It is metaphoric. So, psychotherapy in the metaphorical domain also becomes psychotherapy of transference, but in a way that Freudians tend not to do it. And I will read you a transcript by someone who's psychoanalytically oriented, one of my students, that I actually just read yesterday. The papers are in for this first half of class, and I brought them with me, and I was reading them, and this was so interesting that I'm going to read it to you. And she did some work with a client with a metaphor, and compares how she thinks the differences between the work and the outcome of the work and the psychoanalytic interpretations and the issues of transference that had been the focus of the therapy, both and its former therapy. In any case, my point is, and my view is, that when we do psychotherapy in the metaphorical domain, we are doing what psychoanalysts would call transference therapy, and we are affecting the transference of the individual, both within the therapy and in terms of anybody else that they transfer things to or carry meaning over to. In Adlerian terms, we are doing lifestyle transformational therapy. Okay. A note about object relations theory in the metaphorical domain. Object relations theory, we could talk a whole morning on object relations theory. We spent a whole class on it, as I do in my school. The main issues are that object relations theory changes the theory of how people, what psychic structure is. From ego, id, and superego, they throw that out, basically. Most of the object relations theories reject that idea. And they reject biological determinism also, and instinct theory and drive theory. Instead, they say that psychic structure involves relations between an image of self that develops early in childhood and an image of others that develops early in childhood. And the others are called objects, a leftover from Freud's notion. So object relations theory is looking at the relations between oneself and actual other people, and the relationship between one's self-image and one's image of others. See how that gets closer to Adlerian thinking? Because we define lifestyle as the self-image, the image of others, and we have some other things that are important, but it begins to get a little closer. Developmental theory of object relations in the metaphorical domain focuses on the same distinction we were mentioning earlier. See, even though the object relations theorists talk about self-images and images of others, they don't work imaginally. It's as if, just as Adlerians talk about self-images and images of others, but don't work with the images. It's a return to the basic idea that self-images are actually images, and other images are actually images. And when somebody uses a metaphor, as some of you were saying, one of my clients once in a couple therapy said, a wife said about the husband, it's like trying to tame a wild lion. That's self-other relationships, that's self-object relationship, that's lifestyle and lifestyle movement in relationship to other people. The person is playing the role of a lion tamer. Husband's playing the role of lion. The image of self is an image of a lion tamer. It's an actual image of a lion tamer. It's an image. And the image of others is the image of a lion. That's self-object relations, self-other relations. In imagery, metaphors are those. So another way of looking at working in the metaphorical domain is you're working with the actual self-object relations. And one of the things that happens in the metaphorical domain when you do this kind of work is people often spontaneously think of early recollection because they're the same kind. And early recollection is also an image, and it's also a metaphor. What I want to do now is I want to read a case example of metaphorical therapy. I want to give you a feel for what the process is like. I want to highlight some of the methods, and also through the case I want to illustrate some of the concepts in the theories that we're talking about, psychodynamic theory, but then as we go through cognitive behavioral family and Adlerian theory, we'll use this case as kind of a reference point so that you can see how it manifests itself in therapy. Now, to tell you a little bit about the therapist. The therapist's name is Marie. She's a student, third-year student in our program. That means she's completed the first 2 years. It also means that she's had a 1 year of internship and possibly no experience as a therapist, because just because you're in an internship doesn't mean that you see clients. A lot of times our internships in the first year focus on diagnostic testing, intakes, and that's all. Sometimes they're in schools for difficult children of various kinds, including learning disabilities. So I don't know what her therapy background is, but it's possible that these are the first clients that she's seen. It's also possible that she has 1 year of 10 hours a week experience, some of which would be with therapists. In other words, she's not a well-trained therapist at this point. She is seeing a man who we call Joe. And Joe is a 30-year-old Caucasian male of American descent. He is an inpatient voluntarily participating in a year-long residential rehabilitation program and is diagnosed with cocaine dependence. Joe has been in the program for 7 months, 2 of which I've been his therapist. So she's been seeing him basically for 8 weeks. And she sees him twice a week. So that's 16 sessions so far. His presenting problem is his drug dependence. some background information on Joe so you kind of get an idea of who Joe is. He has one brother, Tom, who is 3 years his junior. While growing up, Joe felt very protective of his brother and continues to feel that way today. He says that he spent much of his adult life bailing him out of trouble, just as he did when they were children. Joe spent much of his childhood trying to make his father proud of him, yet nothing he did earned him the approval or attention he so desperately craved. The only attention Joe recalls receiving from his father was in the form of beatings inflicted on himself, his brother, and his mother. So he did not have a good start in life. Joe graduated from high school and immediately left home. Not surprising. He drifted around the country for a few years, going from job to job and city to city, but eventually he met Kathy, a, quote, successful and beautiful woman whom he married after dating her for 1 year. Joe and Kathy began having marital problems, and this marked the beginning of Joe's drug problem and his drug use and eventual drug dependence. His marriage ended, and he's had no contact with his ex-wife or child since. He began drifting around the country again, however, this time he was slowly destroying himself with cocaine. After 2 years of aimless drifting, Joe came back to California. As a favor to his mother, Joe let his brother move in with him, even though he knew his brother was using drugs at the time. Now, Joe had not been using drugs. In retrospect, Joe says that he knew that if he allowed his brother to live with him, that he himself would start using again. But he let him move in anyway because he couldn't say no to his mother. So you get the picture of dependence, from a family systems point of view, tremendous enmeshment within the family system, overprotection. He snorted coke with his brother the first night that he was there, and he was soon on a collision course with disaster. Within a few weeks, he was again taking cocaine intravenously. He lost his job and had stolen $10,000 from his girlfriend to buy drugs. His girlfriend was living with him. Soon after, his girlfriend and mother convinced him to enter the treatment program. He has not used during the 7 months he's been in treatment. I have an arrow here that says, good for his girlfriend. Can you imagine that? Your boyfriend rips you off for $10,000 to buy drugs, and you stay there and urge him to get into a treatment program. That's nice.
That's a woman for
That's great. After having seen Joe 6 times, so this is the 7th session of therapy that this occurred. Now, one of the reasons I want to attend to that is sometimes in therapy, not so much in Adlerian therapy, but in other forms of therapy, talk about needing to develop a rapport over a long period of time before you get into deep kind of work. The second point is that more and more our focus in the States is on forms of brief psychotherapy. Now, Adlerian psychology is a brief form of brief psychotherapy. But with the economics of psychotherapy moving more and more to HMOs, PPOs, restricted insurance coverage, the need for short-term models becomes more and more important. And you might be interested, one psychologist I know says that if you practice long-term therapy with clients who only have short-term coverage and will be forced to terminate, you are vulnerable to an ethical complaint of abandoning your client. Interesting. In any case, I'm about to go into the actual therapy in the 7th session. After having seen Joe 6 times, he came in one day in a very pensive and serious mood. Previously, he had presented himself in a more upbeat manner when entering my office. Calmly, he began to describe his predicament. So here's the dialogue that followed. Joe says, I spoke to my mother today, and she told me that Tom told her that I told him I'd help him pay to have some dental work done, but hadn't given him the money yet. It makes me so mad when he does that. Therapist, it makes you mad when he talks to her instead of you? Yeah, it pisses me off. That's the way my family has always done things. No one ever tells the person they're mad at that they're mad. They tell someone else, and that person is supposed to do the dirty work for them. Usually, I'm the one they come and dump everything on. I'm sick of being the garbage man. Therapist ears prick up. Oh boy. Therapist says, how does it feel being a garbage man? The therapist, when she says this, is entering into the metaphorical domain. And she's entering it with a how does it feel question. We'll go over other ways to do it. But how does it feel? Notice she doesn't interpret, she doesn't say anything, she doesn't ask a specific question. She invites the client to do what we call an inner search. Inner search is looking inward. All of the questions in working in the metaphorical domain stimulate the client to look inward. Any question which focuses, even if it's related to the metaphor, focuses the client outward is not doing the job as we conceive it in terms of doing work in the therapy. For example, if the therapist at this point said, how much garbage do you collect in a day? Or what kind of garbage is it? That would not be psychotherapy in the metaphorical domain, because the client's experience would be, I have to think about this question I'm being asked and answer the question. So the client is being focused on the therapist's version of reality, which is totally different in process than the therapist says, how does it feel being the garbage man? Can you see the difference? He says, like shit. Everyone brings their junk to me and I have to do something with it. Sounds like a dirty, stinky job. So that's a little empathic reflection there. And she says, what do you do with all the junk? Joe says, I try to sort it out, salvage what I can, and then, I don't know, what I'd like to do is just throw the rest of the stuff away and forget it, but I never can. I'm always stuck with it. She says, so you keep getting dumped on, and then you're still stuck with it. Wow. Now, what I would have suggested at that point is to ask what gets in the way of you throwing the stuff away and forgetting about it. So he said that I would like to, but, the yes, but statement. So I'd like to explore in the metaphor what gets in the way. But what she does is fine. She goes to the second method that we'll be talking about, and it is a metaphorical transformation. And she asks the question in the way that I suggested. Do this. And that is, what if you could change that image? A very simple question, but a very poignant one where you're working with something that is so fundamental. How would you change it so it would be better for you? Joe says, I don't know, I guess and then he laughs, which means something is happening inside. He says, I'd put up a sign, dumped closed. Dumped closed. Dumped closed. And that, see, when you have that kind of reaction, you know something nice is happening. Because the humor is appealing. Dumped closed. Then they'd all have to get rid of their own trash. Marie says, the garbage man wouldn't be taking in any more trash deliveries. And then she says, after she says, wouldn't take any more trash deliveries, she says, good idea. Then she says, what would that be like for you? One of our favorite questions. I actually learned that question from Fran. That's one of our favorite questions. What would that be like for you? What's your experience of it? It's a very experiential kind of therapy, as you can see. Joe says, it would be great. I take care of my own stuff, you know, my problems, and they take care of theirs. And we'd all probably be a lot happier. Marie, the therapist, says, well, what would it be like for you to take care of yourself without taking care of your mother and your brother too? I don't know. It sure would feel different. I've always watched out for them. I'm always bailing Tom out of trouble. So now he returns to a metaphor he's used. But she is going to now enter into the metaphorical domain around bailing. See what happens. What image comes to mind when you think about bailing Tom out? That's another way of doing it. Notice we're focusing on imagery. If you ask the person, what does that mean to you? You get a very different answer. You are not doing metaphorical therapy. But when you ask for the image, you are. We're moving into the imaginal domain here. Joe says, listen to the creativity. Bailing Tom out is not especially creative. It is a common metaphor. But listen when you ask for the image. what happens. Joe says, there I am with a bucket. And no matter how fast I work, the water keeps coming in, or at least it doesn't seem to get any lower. And there's Tom off to one side, floating on one of those floating lounge chairs, drinking a six-pack. Geez, what a jerk. Therapist, who's a jerk? Now, what's interesting about that question, it's a wonderful question, but the therapist clarifies why she asks it here. I asked who was a jerk because I wasn't clear who he meant. It wasn't a major therapeutic turned out to be. She just wasn't sure. The reality is that when he said it, he was referring to his brother. And I think the metaphor made his feelings of being dumped on feel so present and real, and that's one of the effects of the metaphorical work. That this here and now experience, combined with the prompt of such a seemingly minuscule question as, who's the jerk? Not so minuscule. Allowed him a different perspective of his image. And this is a transformation of the self-image. Right here. For the first time, he saw how hard he was working to try and bail out the water for his brother while his brother was lounging and drinking, not doing a thing to help. Joe decided, we talk about making a new decision earlier in psychology, Joe decided that he was the one being a jerk. Because there was his brother, perfectly capable of grabbing a pail and helping, but he chose not to. Still in the metaphor. Right? Still in the metaphor. Joe was amazed at how it felt. Like what it felt like, oh wait a minute. Joe was amazed at how it felt like his view of his brothers and his relationship had changed almost instantly. And we sometimes see this in the metaphorical work. He had always assumed his brother needed him to take care of him. Now he felt like his brother had been taking advantage of his protective feelings toward him. Now notice that insight came through the imagery work. And when it's done in imagery, you don't forget it. Because images, the research shows that images are remembered almost perfectly. Any image memory is and words are not. So one of the other advantages of this in terms of the function of memory is that not only is it experientially powerful, but you just think of all he has to do, and he will. When he thinks of his brother, and he thinks of him bailing him out, he's going to see his brother on this lounge chair drinking a six-pack. And that interrupts the behavior. Now, we were talking in the break. When I said that if you're just interested in changing behavior, which behaviorists are, this is incompatible. It's incompatible with the behaviorist methodology and theory, but it's not incompatible with changing behavior. We do change behavior, and behavior does change. It changes as a result of the metaphorical work, and you'll see that in this example. Now he felt like his brother had been taking advantage of his protective feelings toward him. Joe said he talked about this with his old therapist, but although he knew intellectually his brother was an adult, he could never feel okay about telling him that he had to take care of himself, telling his brother he had to take care of himself because he didn't think he really could. Now he could see, and that means literally see, just how capable and clever his brother really is. And Joe said, quote, "After all, why take care of yourself if you got someone doing it for you?" Now, he generated that insight out of the metaphorical work. The therapist did not point that out to him. And I believe it's much more powerful when you discover it on your own. And it also, the whole notion here is to empower the client, because the client is doing the therapy through that work. Therapist, a little nudge here, a little bit here, a little thing there, but it's the client's arena, and the client is creating the images, they're creating the change, and that makes it much more impactful. Outcome. One of the things I'm excited about in terms of this approach, I always wanted to do this, and several years I got to the point where I felt like I could say to a class of students that was starting learning this approach, that the criteria for success in this class is not the way I do therapy and what happens with my clients, and it's not how much you learn. Whether this material is valuable or not, as far as I'm concerned, and whether I reach my goals, will be determined by whether the clients that you are seeing change as a result of you using this information. If they do, I've been successful. If they don't, I have not. And so we are interested in not just what happens in the therapy, gee, that seems really great, but what happened after the therapy, and did it have any effect? Here's what the therapist reports. Since this session, my client has taken a stand in situations involving his brother and his mother. Joe told his brother that he was not going to pay for his dental work. When Joe explained to me that Tom does have a full-time job and is living free at their mother's, it was as though he was amazed at himself for never realizing that Tom had absolutely no financial obligations to me, yet Joe was always ready to give him money. Joe took care of his needs in the situation with his mother as well. This is even more striking. Previous to the metaphorical session I've described, Joe had told me he felt indebted to his mother for her emotional support while he's been in the program, and that as a thank you, he wanted to send her on a European vacation, something that she's always wanted to do. A pattern in Joe's family, so when we talk about family dynamics, we'll return to this in terms of an example, because here we're doing individual therapy, the metaphorical domain, but as you will see, we're actually doing family therapy with an individual, because we're looking at the individual's representation of family dynamics in metaphor, and family structure and family dynamics is metaphorical, and I'll make the argument later. A pattern in Joe's family since childhood has been to do things for one another as a way of saying thank you or I love you. Never did they simply say it in words. So now Joe felt obligated to provide this vacation for his mother even though he could not financially afford it. He wanted to be able to say the words, thank you for your support and I love you. But he didn't think the words would mean anything to his mother. And he still felt obligated to give her the trip, even though he knew it would take all of the money he had left, which he needed to get an apartment and a car once he left the program. That's the degree to which this family process as a whole. However, soon after the metaphorical session, he was able to tell his mother, in words, that he loved her, that he appreciated all her support, and he thanked her. It was a very difficult thing to do, I'll bet. First time he'd ever done it. First time anybody, it's breaking a family rule. First time anybody in the family had ever done it. It was a very difficult thing for him to do, but he was glad that he did. Joe told me he couldn't help but tell her that if he could someday afford to, he would send her on the trip. I feel a little guilty. That's okay, you can say that. Her response to him was to tell him not to worry, that it was okay. That part's nice. Then she said, but can you just give Tom the money for his dental work like he promised? Like he promised, his guilt. Right? Now, what did Joe do? This is part of the family pattern. One metaphorical thing, what did he do when his mother says that, with all that pull and stuff? Joe grinned, as he told me the story, and said, quote, I can change myself, I can't change my family. And that was his response. Now that's leaving the enmeshment. That's differentiating, and in Bohemian terms, differentiating from the family. Now whether that actually has occurred, we can only tell over the coming months and years of whether that pattern continues. But certainly it seems like the changes that occurred in the metaphorical session, working with a metaphor, have translated into behavioral changes and even systemic changes within the family. So that's the example. How many of you read Heinz Kohut or are familiar with self-psychology? One of his contributions in psychoanalytic theory is to distinguish between experientially distant interpretations, like psychoanalytic interpretations, and experientially near interpretations. So that the idea is to interpret, but with empathy for where the client is. using that distinction, I call metaphorical therapy, or therapy in the metaphorical domain, experientially intimate. Because it's as an intimate a level of empathy, I think, that you can get and experience and create in therapy, and this and some of the other examples, I think. Beck and other cognitive therapists focus on. One is what he calls a cognitive event, or later called automatic thoughts. And these are thoughts that occur in streams of consciousness. When you ask for them, the person is aware that they occur. Another is more a deeper kind of level, more basic level cognitive schema, which are basic assumptions or attitudes. It's quite similar to Adlerian lifestyle theory, though Adlerian lifestyle theory has a lot of other dimensions. For example, holism, creativity, purpose and goal, and social embeddedness, which is not present in cognitive therapy. To be consistent with the ideas of the metaphorical construction of reality in only the most general sense. And that is that the beliefs that a person has and the automatic thoughts that a person says to themselves represent an as-if statement. And it is as if the actual situation were what the belief is. So that the belief that a person has, using the example here, unless I do everything perfectly, I am a failure, the person will carry that meaning over to situations. So in that sense, which is a general sense, cognitive behavior therapy is metaphorical. But it is clearly not psychotherapy in the metaphorical domain. And the reason has to do with the nature of thought and cognition that it focuses on. We'll clarify that point in a moment. But what I want to say at this point is that this kind of thinking, when you're focusing on thought and you're focusing on assumptions and beliefs, you're thinking about, or you're representing cognition in a syllogistic or propositional form. And we'll clarify that in a moment. But I want you to return to the first statement. That's a cognitive event as a thought, reminiscence, or image occurring in free-flowing stream of consciousness. But Beck never works with images. And he never works with reminiscences, which are basically early recollection. He sure should. Because if we work with images, the early memories could be interpreted to identify cognitive schemas. If you like to work with cognitive schemas, early recollections tell you what the cognitive schemas are. And most cognitive therapists don't realize that. But the other point is that Beck attends to the notion that cognitions involve logical, propositional thought, but they also involve what's called episodic memory in the memory literature, memories of episodes that occurred a long time ago, and images, but that's not part of the therapy. It got lost somewhere. So one of the ways that you can see psychotherapy in the metaphorical domain and the metaphorical construction of reality is you can see it as a cognitive therapy that emphasizes imaginal cognition and metaphorical analogical thought. That's both the similarity and the difference with regard to cognitive therapy. Now let's go on to the next page, and we'll get a little clearer on what this notion of syllogism and syllogistic stuff is. I'd like you to read the first couple of sentences there. Cognition is it is verbal, it is linear, it is sequential, it is logical. And the example, Plato's syllogism is the one that's used most prototypically to describe a syllogism. Men die, Socrates is a man, Socrates will die. So what you have is, first of all, a premise, followed by a special case, which leads to a conclusion. That's a logical sequence, deductive reasoning. So the characteristic of if-then statements of propositional thinking is that they move from premise to conclusion, and that is the format in which cognitive therapy describes beliefs. It's also the format in which adherent psychology describes beliefs. Now we're going to contrast that with imaginal cognition, and that's visuospatial. And one of the things that has been identified in the hemispheric laterality research is that the right hemisphere in most people is dominant for visuospatial processing of imagery. And the left hemisphere is dominant for most forms of verbal process, not all, and there's some overlap, but the emphasis is there. So imaginal cognition, because it occurs at once, there is an image, it is also holistic rather than sequential or analytic. And it is also simultaneous. In other words, the image appears all at once. Whereas men die occurs first in time, then Socrates is a man, that occurs next in time. Now the conclusion is Socrates will die. That is, occurs in linear time. And whereas imaginal cognition is simultaneous, happens all at once. Now, one example of visual or imaginal cognition is what Einstein referred to as his most felicitous thought. And that was the birth of relativity theory. The birth of relativity theory occurred with an image, and many of Einstein's ideas occurred as a result of an image that he created in his mind's eye. The one for relativity was that he pictured an elevator falling in free fall as a man in the elevator. And the felicitous thought was realizing that that man was simultaneously in motion and at rest, depending on the system of reference of the observer, which meant that motion was relative to the system of reference of the observer. It was not a fixed kind of motion. Then he went and did the mathematics, but that was where the basic idea came from. That's an example of imaginal thought, insight through imaginal thought. Now, Einstein, I always struggle with Poincaré, so I was struggling early. Einstein, and sounds like I'm getting my New York accent back. Poincaré, you guys know French. How would you pronounce that? Poincaré. Okay. Niels Bohr, I got that one. And Werner Heisenberg. These are all physicists, and among others, observed that syllogistic thinking or verbal modes of thought were not useful in what is called productive thinking, namely creating new ideas. There's a wonderful book written by a Harvard psychologist on the role of imagery in scientific creativity. And he reviews the notes and biographies and stuff of these people, as well as others, and also the research in this area. And the conclusion is that if you want to create a new pattern, a new association, a new way of looking at things, propositional thought is not useful to do that. If you want to become more knowledgeable about what exists, propositional thought is very useful. But if you want to create new things that exist or look at things that exist in new ways, it is images that allow you to do that. And metaphors as well. We talked about metaphor, novelty, and creativity earlier. Now, where does this lead us? It seems to me that it leads us to the conclusion that imaginal thinking is the preferred mode of thought for creating new connections. And what are we trying to do in therapy? Change, create new dimensions. If we want to do that, should we not be using imaginal thought much more, imaginal cognition in ourselves as well as in our clients, much more than we are now, which is probably almost not at all. And my hypothesis is that one of the reasons why therapy tends to be slow is because we use syllogistic, propositional forms of thought to try and create change. And we're using the wrong language to create change. And when we use imaginal language, we can achieve, it doesn't always happen, but we can achieve change at a very deep level much more quickly. And I read one example, I'll read a couple of others, and we'll do some role playing, and you're going to see that. But anyway, that's one of the points for today. Okay, turning the page. Read the last two items. And what I hope to get you to the point of with this material, and I've given a lot of thought, and it's very specific when we get to the methodology stuff. I've got sheets they actually can hold in front of you when you have a client and you read the questions. So you just use the right language. And there's nothing like seeing that happen in somebody that you're working with, have been working with, and have been doing things, and you've made some progress, but there's still an awful lot to be done. And then you do this work, and then you see this unfolding of all the change. And there's nothing like it. It's just an incredible experience. And an incredible experience to be in the presence of a client who is doing this. Okay, moving right along, we now shift gears and focus, leave the world of the individual, actually not, but, and enter into the world of family therapy. Family therapy is a hodgepodge of many different things, and there's a wide range of theories in family therapy, with some general overlapping and a lot of difference. In general, the characteristic of family therapy that is unique is that they focus on changing the family system as the vehicle for creating change in an individual. We'll get more specific about that, but that's the main difference. Early in family therapy, and to some extent still, family therapy was a reaction against individual therapy, particularly behavioral therapy and psychoanalysis. A reaction that said that the individual is embedded in a social system, and unless you work with that social system, you cannot affect change because the person goes back in that social system. That insight is very similar to an Adlerian assumption, but of course family therapists weren't familiar with Adlerian psychology. But still, Adlerians tend not to do what family therapists would call family therapy. They utilize family dynamics to understand the individual, but we still tend to work with the individual rather than with the system. We sometimes change the system by working with the individual, but that's usually our focus. So let's take a look at some of the ideas in Salvador Minuchin's version of family therapy, which he calls structural family therapy. I'll give you an idea of how Minuchin works, and let me tell you that the purpose of all this is to make a case. And the case that I'm making is that the metaphorical construction of reality is not only true in a process that goes on for an individual, which we've been focusing on, but it also is the way that groups and social units, including families, create their reality. Their reality is also metaphoric. And I'm going to use structural family therapy of Minuchin and Haley and Madonis' strategic family therapy to make that argument by talking about their theory of therapy and also the way that they do therapy. So let's take a look at that. Quite enamored with metaphors and uses it. If you said to Minuchin, do therapy, but you may not use metaphors, you could not do therapy. That's how central it is. He also says that family structure is metaphor, and that's how he uses metaphor to identify it. And he also changes the metaphors or utilizes metaphorical communication to change family structure. The example, I want to elaborate on the example of mother is wired into the family, and aha, tightening the wires again. Minuchin's a very clever therapist. How many of you seen him work? Seen it in a videotape somewhere? Right? So Adlerians have trouble with Minuchin because he's not, would you say, client-centered, phenomenologically centered, other than his own phenomenology. He's very directive, and very often that overshadows the creativity of this guy. What we'll focus on today is the use of metaphor and also how he uses it that's different from what we're talking about. Now, when he said mother is wired into the family, the reason he chose that metaphor is that father, who was the identified patient in the family session, depression, was an electrician. And he was talking to another family member about mother in a language that father could understand. And that's why he created that metaphor. And that's the basis of a lot of his work. So Mnuchin is a good example of someone who creates a lot of metaphors as a therapist, but doesn't attend to any of the metaphors that the clients use. And why somebody would be so important, find metaphors so important and not focus on what metaphors that their clients are using is an anathema. It's the power of the points of view that we have that enable us to ignore things. Because the focus is on the system, so we're going to ignore the individual. And indeed they do. But how more powerful it could be to utilize the metaphors that the clients use to describe in family therapy and work with those metaphors. So when he says, aha, tightening the wires again, he's using a metaphor, say it's as if mother was connected with wires, and when the dependence increases and her control increases, she tightens the wires. So clearly he's using metaphorical language to describe a change in family structure and to describe family structure. In terms of the theoretical aspect of this, that supports the idea that family structure is metaphoric and that family reality is constructed metaphorically. Now notice what happens when we make that statement. We have a theory that says the way an individual constructs reality is the same as the way a family constructs reality. I don't think there's a theory that does that. And once you do that, you certainly have an opportunity to integrate individual and family therapy because you're using the same theoretical base to describe both. They're isomorphically related with each other. So in terms of therapy integration, I think that's exciting. Okay, now read the last three items. There is an aspect of that that is relevant to what we've been talking about, and that is what happens in mother, father, and the children when Mnuchin says, aha, tightening the wires again. It does invite them, if not force them, to process that metaphorically. It is, I think, impossible to receive that phrase and think logically about it. So it does create in the client a processing in terms of the metaphorical domain. It doesn't have the same qualities we've been describing, but in that sense it is metaphorical. The final idea, by focusing on the metaphorical construction of reality of individual and family members in relationship to metaphorical construction of reality in the family, therapy in the metaphorical domain integrates the individual and family levels of metaphorically constructed reality, emphasizing the interrelated patterns of speech cognition and behavior. So here we're saying that the therapy that we've been describing with regard to the individual also applies to the way groups get together and the way that they interact and the social construction of reality. The individual also applies to the way groups get together and the way that they interact and the social construction of reality. Yes?
Just the issue of the electrician. There's something that bothers me about that. Like, it's like he gave the family another way to describe themselves, but he empowered the father because the father is the electrician. So any reference to my discussion of family would have to defer to father's knowledge of what are actually electrical within that metaphor. Am I pursuing that properly?
Well, he's doing two things there. One, wired is a general enough idea that most of the family members will kind of relate to it, although father clearly more than any other. And that's his choice at that point. That's indeed what he wants, since father is identified as the patient and is carrying the symptoms of the family. So he's the one that basically he wants to kind of speak to in the context of working in the family. But what you raise is a good point, and it is a problem with family therapy in general. And it is something that I think therapy in the metaphorical domain is a corrective for. And that is that family therapy, like other directive therapies, relies on the therapist's judgment about a particular goal that they want to accomplish, and then they create, in this case, a metaphorical intervention to accomplish that goal. So the metaphor is used in response to their own thinking and their own goal and their own understanding of what's going on, rather than being responsive to the person sitting in front of them, although if they're good, there'll be some relationship between the two. Now, by the way, how many of you are familiar with Ericksonian hypnosis? Milton Erickson. Any of you who are familiar, you may be wondering why I'm not talking much about that. I'm not talking at all about that. Well, one of the reasons, because he's noted for metaphors. There's a lot of books that he has, these metaphors. As much as Erickson and Ericksonians talk about metaphors, they do two things. Metaphors are equated with stories and anecdotes. They don't work with linguistic metaphors that clients use. They work with stories. And the stories are created as metaphors. But to hear them talk, there's no difference between their stories and working metaphorically. There's a book by Barker, for example, called Using Metaphors in Therapy. You would think that that is a general book about different ways to use metaphors. It is not. It's a way of using constructed metaphorical stories to create change in clients. And it's the only method he talks about. Similarly, though NLP goes into some other areas, that tends to be characteristic, at least the early and middle writings in NLP. So one of the problems I have with that approach, or one of the things I don't think it addresses, is this sensitivity to the individual's language and the focus on stimulating the process within the individual, though that's the ultimate goal of Ericksonian methods, is to stimulate this process. But they move through it through a very directive kind of approach where there is a goal that the therapist has in mind, and they're going to create a story in order to reach that goal. So people who are more client-centered in their attitude, focus more on kind of respecting the client, are more psychodynamically oriented. Any of the models that are not directive don't relate to that approach. And this is a way of utilizing metaphor in a way that doesn't require you to be directive. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't use that kind of approach. It's antithetical to who I am as a therapist, what I would want to accomplish as a therapist, and how I'd want to treat people. And family therapy, particularly Haley's work, is very influenced by Erickson's work, so you see that, commonality. Other ideas that are quite interesting in relationship to metaphor. Here, in strategic therapy, the focus is on metaphorical communication in families and the idea that there are multiple contexts and reference for different behaviors. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. But one of the things that I think is interesting with regard to this area is that it also, though different from structural family therapy, supports the idea that family reality and interactive systemic processes are metaphoric in nature, which I take as support for the theory that family reality is constructed metaphorically in relationship, in this case, to behavior. A behavior or symptom can be a metaphor for another family member's fear or symptom. An example of that Madonis gives in her book, Strategic Family Therapy, is a child who is afraid to go to school may be expressing his own fears, on the one hand, but his own expression of his own fears may also be a metaphor for his mother's fear. So it also may represent somebody else's experience or feeling. And that's the idea of multiple references. So in families, the idea of metaphor carries over not only internal to external in terms of image or language, but it also occurs in behavior. And that behavior is metaphorical. Now we have clear examples of that in Adlerian psychology. The most direct and obvious of which is organ jargon. And the notion that symptoms like I have a headache or I got a pain in the neck is a way of speaking. And it's a metaphorical speech. Adler said, let me get this right, he said something effective, the mouth may lie, the mind may fail to understand, but the body always tells the truth. And so the body, for Adler, is a way of form of communication, and those messages in organ jargon are metaphors. They are metaphorical communication. It's another way in which our reality is expressed, in this case through behavior, through symptoms, and through our body. An interesting view of that is in a book called Metaphors We Live By, by George Lakoff and Johnson, is his last name, published by University of Chicago Press. And it's by a linguist and a philosopher. Basically isn't a psychology book, but it is the basis on which all of these ideas began. The main shift for me in the centrality of metaphor came when I read that book. And it was suggested to me by a student in my class. And up till then, I was interested in metaphors, but you know what I did with them? I was interested in metaphors as one of the most important kinds of data to interpret lifestyle. And it was only later that I discovered that metaphors themselves were a representation of lifestyle in a different form of cognition. And it's a book about culture and how cultures socially create metaphorical meaning. And the idea of metaphorical construction of reality comes from that book. The example that he gives at the beginning of the book is how we talk about arguments. We use language like, he shot down my argument. Huh? Hot argument, I defeated him in my argument. And the overall metaphor is argument is war. And the point is that the metaphor, argument is war, is not just incidental. That the metaphor of war structures the way we think about arguments, the way we feel about arguments, and how we behave in arguments. And that is just one example of many in which our metaphorical social reality is metaphorical. And that's where I got that idea, and it's certainly true psychologically. And the difference between a metaphor and an analogy, mainly the difference is that a metaphor, they're very similar, but in this case, when Madonna's is talking, she's talking that analogical is that they have similar patterns. Metaphorical is that they replace one another, that they represent one another. That's how she's using it. Now the problem, see the interesting thing about the way in which strategic family therapy works with metaphors is because they are so focused on the family context as causing the individual's behavior. They move to the contextual, situational contextual pole of the metaphor and try to change the context. What they do not focus on, because they're not integrated and they're not focusing on the individual, is the fact that the individual is creating the behavior as a result of internal metaphorical processes in which the behavior is created as a function of the situation as perceived by the individual, or actually technically as apperceived by the individual. So what family systems theory misses is that this behavior, which is a function of the context, is a function of the context only because the person who created the behavior created it in relationship to the context. All right? Why don't you see that? So, again, we have the implication of this way of thinking. Doesn't ignore the context. Working with family context can be very powerful and very important. But it's not the only way to do it, and it doesn't mean that there isn't an individual context that not only is important, but is inseparable from what's going on in the family. It's only the therapists and the theories that separate the things. Families aren't separate. They're not separate individuals and families. They're just one thing, doing all kinds of things going on. But it's just when we put on the lenses, so to speak, of a particular approach that we only see certain things. Now, those of us trained in the Chicago school, the Chicago version of Adlerian psychology, which is basically Dreikert, have learned that we often summarize lifestyle as the image of self, image of others, image of life, and what Bernie calls the therefore. I am, life is, therefore. And of course the lifestyle goal or idealized goal. As mentioned earlier, looking at things from the perspective of metaphor is taking the word image very seriously and literally in those phrases. And that when we are working, in contrast to that syllogistic, propositional, logical kind of way that I was describing earlier, when we are working in the realm of imagery, we very much are working with the representation of lifestyle. It's just a different form of cognition that we're using to represent it. And because lifestyle is holistic, because lifestyle involves movement, I believe, and my experiences, and I'd be interested in your reaction, but that metaphor is very close to that, may even be closer than the other form. Because one of the things you'll notice in all of the metaphors is they are all pure movement. All the metaphors describe movement. All the visual patterns describe movement. I am a garbage man. That's a Adler used to use those terms to describe lifestyle. It's the lifestyle of a beggar, used to say. Captures a role. I'm hitting myself over the head with a hammer. The lion tamer and the lion. By the way, in that, I'll tell you what I did with that case. My response was sometimes called confrontational restructuring of the metaphor. Although I'm not thinking about that at the moment, when you do metaphorical work, you just got to do it, and then you think about it later. Because you can't think about it and do it, right? Because you're in the wrong part of your brain, you're the wrong kind of cognitive process. If you're analyzing it, that's why it's hard to learn. Because we're used to knowing through analyzing and thinking about. And as soon as you start doing that, you're not doing the metaphorical work. So it's much more spontaneous. So she said she'd been complaining, they had been talking about each other, and they were complaining about their prenuptial agreement, and how they weren't meeting it, or that kind of stuff. A whole list of problems. When she said, it's like trying to tame a wild lion. I said to her, every lion tamer needs a wild lion. And her reaction was great. I never seen what followed before or since. She leaned back, looked up, said, and the Ericksonians would say she was in a light trance at that point. She said, "Yeah, and if I didn't have him, I'd probably take in strays." You see how we're talking about lifestyle there? We're doing lifestyle, but we're not doing it through interpretive logic. And at that point, she started to laugh and to cry and laugh, and I couldn't tell whether she was crying or laughing. At the same time, she was laughing, she was crying for quite a while, hugged and stroked by her husband. And I don't know, all I can tell you is their problems went away after that. We continued to meet for another 3 or 4 weeks, and without much to talk about. And they described all of the lists of problems kind of melted. Well, what about this, I would say. Well, no, I'm not concerned about that anymore. And he's done some different things about that. So it really changed them. So I would say that when we're doing that kind of work, we are doing lifestyle, but in a different mode of language or in a different domain. Lifestyle is the schema of apperception. Later on, down toward the bottom, so the next to last statement. Psychotherapy in the metaphorical domain adds a dimension to Adlerian therapy and lifestyle theory, which is very close to Adler's views. Adler said that all cognition is the apperception of one thing through another. Sound like metaphor? Sound like analogy? In understanding, we are always dealing with an analogy, an as if. He didn't say that, but this is an as if. All conception and cognition are based on analogical perceptions. He's not talking about logical perceptions. And so it's intriguing to think about concepts, particularly the idea of private logic and scheme of apperception. Most of the time when we describe a person's scheme of apperception, we describe it logically, in terms of the person's private logic. I would say, how about describing it in terms of the person's private analogic? Sounds closer to what Adler was talking about. And how do you do that? Use metaphor. The one I just gave you let's look at that as the person's apperceptive or scheme of apperception. The woman who said, it is like trying to tame a wild lion. What is her apperceptive schema in this situation? She sees herself in what role? What's her lifestyle role?
Controlling.
No, that's a characteristic of it. What is the role that she's describing? I hear Dreiker saying, she told you!
Lion
The lion tamer! Not complicated. She's a lion tamer. She's playing the role of a lion tamer. That's what the metaphor does, create the role. She is a role of a lion tamer. Do you think that that just relates to her with him in this moment? You don't think that that's related to her overall lifestyle? If you looked at early memories, that she is acting as if she was a lion tamer? Control is an aspect, but it's only one. Okay? Now, what is the goal of that movement, of that role, if you are a lion tamer? Your goal is to tame lions. Now, you can't tame lions if you don't have wild lions. If you have tame lions, you don't have anything to do. Okay? Now, it was that Adlerian understanding that was very spontaneous for me at that moment that led me to make the response that I did. You know, every lion tamer needs a wild lion. But it was the Adlerian understanding that led me to do that. But that's an Adlerian understanding of the role, and in terms of her, the way she looked at life. But it shifted because it came out as a complaint. You know, if only he wasn't a wild lion, well, then everything would be okay. It's not true. If it wasn't a wild lion, they wouldn't be involved with each other. And that's what I wanted to show her and how she needed. And her response, you all got. You know, we didn't explain it, but you all got it. When she says, well, I'd have him, I'd probably take in strays. She's saying, yeah, that's me. That's me. She's accepting responsibility in that moment. Seeing the way that that she sees things. And so I would say that when we're working that way, we can certainly describe this work as working with the person's private analogic.
Is the private logic more along the line of the syllogism? You know, I am, life is, therefore.
That's right. What would be a syllogistic summary, nice turn of phrase, syllogistic summary of this woman's lifestyle of a lion tamer? What might be a way of putting that? If then, or I am, life is.
I am a lion tamer, life is a jungle.
Yeah. Therefore,
there's always work to do.
There's always work to do, right. Others are wild lions, or tame lions, or some kind of animal. And but in order for me to have meaning, I need somebody to tame. We probably would move toward more propositional statements influenced by the typical lifestyles that we talk about. For example, moving to control. That would be one. Many of us would glom on to the aspect of control and say that the wild part of things has to do with being out of control. And life is out of control, and it's my job to control it. Now that may be true, but it's just different from looking at the metaphorical way of looking at it. And certainly in terms of change, remember metaphor and imagery we talked about as the language of change. It's easier in therapy, and certainly easier to give the person the experience of change and changing the metaphor than confronting the private logic, I think. Now certainly, I mean, we all do that. I'm not saying not to do that. I mean, we've been doing it. That's why we're here. And we found it effective, otherwise we wouldn't do it. So it's not that it doesn't work or it's not effective. It's just a question of enriching the range of responses that we can make. And what I certainly do in interpretive therapy as well. But what I find most powerful, and what I strive to do, is to link both. So that I'll move into the metaphorical domain for a period of time with someone. And then depending on how much closure and how concrete I'd like to make things, I may do the interpretation after that work in kind of debriefing on it, reflecting on it. Sometimes I'll do that in a session, sometimes I'll wait to see what happens. And sometimes I'll find that I won't do it at all because the shifts that I want to occur have already occurred, and I can't make them any more permanent than the visual imagery that has occurred in the person. So.
What just occurred to me is it's like you're more likely to be effective if you spit in the person's bowl of soup than if you spit at the menu that is a description of the soup.
That's a nice menu. I mean, a nice menu. Did you hear that? You're more likely to be effective if you spit in the person's bowl of soup than if you spit at the menu that has the bowl of soup on it, from which they might order.
Or the recipe.
Or the recipe, the ingredients.
Or the description.
Or the description and the qualities of the soup. Now, of course, the other thing, is what this brings up is, the way Adler spoke. And one of the things that is difficult about Adler, and wonderful about Adler, is that when he wanted to make a point, so to speak, he looked to metaphor to make it. And this was a good example. He didn't come up with paradoxical injunction or therapeutic double bind. He came up with spitting in the patient's soup. Now, that's clearly a metaphor, unless you're a strange therapist with a strange client. Take your client to lunch. Yeah, it's a very good point. We've all experienced the satisfaction of having developed an understanding of lifestyle in the sense of, now what? How do I do with it?
Yeah.
And of course, when we identify basic mistakes, and we try to change them, that's kind of where we go with it. But the metaphorical work that I've described and will continue to illustrate does involve awareness, and does involve a new perspective, and does involve change, and does involve a different decision. It just occurs in the different way in which human beings think. There are two ways that we think. There are two ways that we know. One is propositional logical thinking, and the other is intuitive, metaphorical, analogical kinds of thinking. And I think that's the way Adler thought, because that's the way he spoke. When he talked about not, in terms of when you needed to use early recollections to understand a lifestyle, anybody remember how he talked about that? He said that if the tree is in the forest, you can't see the outline of the tree, but if the tree, so then you need early recollections. But if the tree is on a mountain, there are no trees around it, you can see the lifestyle clearly. And what he was talking about is when a person their lifestyle has not prepared them in a particular way to handle a particular life situation. It is in that situation that you can see the lifestyle clearly. But when people are just functioning, and they're functioning okay, you can't see their lifestyle unless you look for their early recollections. You did those kinds of things all the time. The most important concept he used was social interest. He talks about that as to see with the eyes of another, which was an English author's phrase. And one of the things, of course, in metaphor is that's exactly what you actually are doing when you enter into the metaphorical domain. You're not only seeing with someone else's eyes, because metaphors are visual, and hearing with their ears, because metaphors are auditory as well. But you also are helping the person to get in touch with their own visual and auditory and otherwise sensual experience of the metaphor that they're describing. When we ask, well, what picture do you have? What's your image? That's what we're asking. How do you see the world? And not so much that I can understand it, though that's okay. It's so that you can understand it. That's more important than what I understand. It's what you understand. And not so I can change it for you, but so that you can change it. So that we can explore it. And I invite you, we call this an invitation to transform. The therapist's job is an inviter, not the changer. He creates the opportunity and guides that process. Okay. opportunity and guides that process. Okay. MCR theory in action. Okay, the first setup, between path number one, the first set of ideas, ending in activating imaginal cognition, is a summary of the different theories that we've talked about in relationship to what we're doing when we're entering the metaphoric domain by exploring client-generated metaphors. As we mentioned, we're seeing with the client's eyes, etc. We're also accessing unconscious process. We also are replacing it with I in terms of Freud's where it is, I shall be, because the person says, it's like I'm in a hurricane. That's what it is. And when we explore the it in terms of the metaphor, the person begins to experience it in terms of themselves. And we are moving from unconscious primary process outside of awareness stuff into this more conscious, making it conscious. Stimulating an inner search, I've mentioned. And that's crucial, not only as a concept, but as a tool in the therapy. You need to be constantly vigilant that what you are doing, the way you are speaking, is this stimulating and maintaining an inner search for the person. That means this person is looking within and searching. And the questions that you ask, and the probing that you do, and the sharing that you do, need to have always this quality of the other person internally searching. Now again, those of you familiar with Ericksonian hypnosis, there are a list of not symptoms, but characteristics of a person being in a light trance. Fluttering of eyelids, pallid cheeks, and several other things. And you will often notice when you're doing this work that those are the characteristics of the person when they're doing an inner search. Now let's go on to the actual steps. Step one, invite the person to explore his or her metaphoric image by listening for and noting the metaphors occurring spontaneously as the person discusses his or her problem. Now, if you haven't done this before, you will not find this an obvious or easy task. Some metaphors will hit you over the head, like that one, which maybe didn't hit you over the head. But hopefully, as you continue to work, they will. You know, the goal I have in my courses is, one of the goals is that nobody will ever miss a metaphor, including that one. You know, that's the goal. Whenever you hear a metaphor, you will note it. You become so sensitized to it. It's a different way of listening. It's a whole area that I believe people who are geniuses, like Dreikers, heard all the time. And it's the basis on which they experienced people, but weren't explicit about it. So, listening to metaphors. Now, verbal metaphors are only one aspect. That's what we're focusing on today. But behavior is metaphor. There are all kinds of things that are metaphor. There are other ways of working metaphorically in therapy. Let me just mention one. I was supervising this woman, and one of the things that she was saying was, you know, I can't use metaphor with this woman because the only thing that she will talk about is her clothes. I've seen her 4 times, and she comes in, and the only thing she'll talk about is her dress, and how she's dressed, and whether it fits, and whether it doesn't. She asked me about my clothes. I try to get her into other subjects, and she always returns to the clothes. I think my response to her was, what's wrong with clothes? Everything's a metaphor, if you look at it. All of the issues that she's dealing with her clothes are the issues in her life in terms of the style. And if you look at clothes as a metaphor, then talk about clothes. But think about it as a metaphor. So she said, she was great. And she just said, okay. And she went off, and a couple weeks later, she said, oh, it's been great. Because we started talking about the clothes. I started asking about her clothes. In the morning, how do you decide what to wear? And when you have a conflict of colors, how do you determine which street do you do? Now that scarf really goes well with your shoes. So you really did well in that area. Encouragement, prosperity, all this kind of stuff. Well, she reported that this woman had never had anybody be interested in her clothes. And you can see why. It was the only thing she found. So it developed a sense of rapport, a sense of alignment, a sense of empathy, and she began talking about the issues involved in the clothes, and after another 3 sessions, she didn't talk about clothes. She talked about the issues. But it had to feel safe for her to do that. And, when adolescents come in, they talk about their skateboarding. What's wrong with skateboarding? Skateboarding is life. Skateboarding is a metaphor for life. You have to balance. There are no brakes. How do you decide where to get off? Where to go? You get on it, you can't stop. It's a metaphor for adolescents. You get on it, you can't stop. You got to go fast. Whatever it is. Basketball. Another example. A client of one of my students who was just learning how to do metaphor had a youngster. He's about 9 years old. And he was referred to an agency because he molested a 5-year-old girl. And he would not talk about the molestation. So what should I do? So my suggestion was, well, what does he talk about? He talks about basketball, that's all he talks about, basketball. So, well, let's use basketball as a metaphor. Let me talk about ways to do that. 2 weeks went by, and the second session after the supervision, the youngster came in and was really angry with himself for a mistake that he had made. So the therapist seized this opportunity quite creatively to utilize basketball as a metaphor for what he wanted to communicate, so using the client's language. So what he said to the youngster was, when Larry Bird and Magic Johnson make a mistake, what do? The kid thought, he says, it doesn't bother them. And he went into a couple of stories of when one of them missed a shot and it cost a major tournament, and sometimes they go in, sometimes they don't. And that was it. That was the intervention. And within 5 minutes, he was talking about the molestation. And that's powerful. There's no attempt to get to his underlying feelings, no attempt to get at it. Just showing respect and responding to what he was talking about, but looking at it as the content, as a metaphor. So it's another way to work. There are many ways to work. We're just scratching the surface with regard to spoken metaphors, but I think they're the ones that are most salient. They're the best illustration of this work. They're the most experientially near, and the others are kind of trickier and more indirect, so I'm not focusing on them today. And by the way, in my own experience, and I certainly didn't think that when I left engineering and mathematics and became a music major, which is where I started, and I did that not by choice. I did that for survival because I was on academic probation twice at UCLA as an engineering major and a math major. And so I switched to math because I could pass it. I could actually not get F's and D's. Also began to actually enjoy it. It was the first time I enjoyed anything in my life that was academic, and I actually began to work, thereby confounding those who believed I was lazy, which I was. I just didn't realize that the reason I was lazy is because there wasn't anything I was interested in. And then around age 20, I got something I was interested in, and then I became non-lazy. And so I graduated with a bachelor's degree in music. And you'll hear some of it tonight. But that's where my metaphorical work comes in, because music is metaphor and sound, and sometimes quite visual, actually, and patterns and notes. And, some of the terms that we use to describe music are visual, like colors and tones. So this aspect of exploring metaphors and entering into the metaphorical domain is focused on yourself and how you are present with the person. And what I invite you to do is to attend to the images that you've experienced. Our path to exploring client-generated metaphors is by listening with the third eye, and that's your eye. So let's take a look at these. First, attend to your own internal images as you listen to the person. Now, some of you who think visually and metaphorically will do this naturally, but many of you won't. That doesn't mean you don't have images. Everybody does. I want to turn up the focus, turn up the volume on the images. Use a mixed metaphor. You want to hear those images more clearly. You want to see them more loudly. As long as we're doing that. When listening to the person, explore his or her metaphor. So this is the first kind of listening. As the person is exploring the metaphor, what I want you to do is listen with your mind's eye. That's what I call listening with the third eye. I want you to listen to what they're describing by seeing in your mind's eye what it is they're describing. Not thinking about it. Not looking for the meaning, or the interpretation, or the belief in it, or the basic assumption in it, or the basic mistake in it. It's a different way. So I invite you to practice and train yourself to listen to the images. See the images that evokes in you as you listen. Remember, images are seen as they're unconscious. That's your unconscious talking. Unconscious talks in imagery, not language. So you get access to your own intuitive sense in making connection with the other person, not mediated through logic and deduction and consciousness, but intuitively. Let the images form in your mind's eye and attend to them as you hear the other person's words. And then share the image. Now, if you haven't done this, it becomes quite uncomfortable and sometimes anxiety-producing to do this. But once you do it and you see the response, it's you'll be hooked. So you want to do more of it. Now, how do you share the image? It is important how you share the image, because you want to do it again in a way that stimulates an inner search and is not directive and doesn't choose for the client what it is they should be attending to. I realized that the reason I was lazy is because there wasn't anything I was interested in. And then around age 20, I got something I was interested in, and then I became non-lazy. And so I graduated with a bachelor's degree in music. And you'll hear some of it tonight. But that's where my metaphorical work comes in, because music is metaphor and sound, and sometimes quite visual, actually. Patterns of the notes. And, some of the terms that we use to describe music are visual, like colors and tones. So this aspect of exploring metaphors and entering into the metaphorical domain is focused on yourself and how you are present with the person. And what I invite you to do is to attend to the images that you've experienced. And we're going to do an exercise this afternoon that will help you identify what it is I'm talking about in this process. When listening to the person, explore his or her metaphor. So this is the first kind of listening. As the person is exploring the metaphor, what I want you to do is listen with your mind's eye. That's what I call listening with the third eye. I want you to listen to what they're describing by seeing in your mind's eye what it is they're describing. Not thinking about it. Not looking for the meaning, or the interpretation, or the belief in it, or the basic assumption in it, or the basic mistake in it. It's a different way. So I invite you to practice and train yourself to listen to the images. Now, if your clients allow you to tape them, it's a wonderful way for you to learn this process, because it's a lot easier to do it when you listen to the tape than when you're in the session. A little further on, I have some examples, and there are others, of blocks to learning this process. And one of them is that the person is going to say something and want you to respond to it while you're doing this work. And what are they going to do? Some people are very nervous about that. They say, well, if I tend to the metaphors, then say, well, what about my mother? And, what? I was thinking about your and if you're looking inward to your own imagery, it might be weird for the other person. I don't think so, and I'm a little weird anyway as a therapist, so sometimes my clients say, what are you doing? I'm attending to my own imagery. Describe what it is going on. It's so interesting. At least to me, and I see if it's interesting or not. So as they're describing and discussing and exploring their metaphor, let your images form in your mind's eye and attend to them as you hear the other person's words describing the metaphoric image. You're going to be connected with them in a very direct way. The closeness that you feel, the sense of merger is really nice when it's working well. The second is when you're listening to the person not describe a metaphor that they're exploring, but just describing anything. Any situation, any behavior, any feeling, any thought, any belief, listen to the images. See the images that evokes in you as you listen. Remember, images are seen as they're unconscious. That's your unconscious talking. Unconscious talk is an imagery, not language. So you get access to your own intuitive sense in making connection with the other person, not mediated through logic and deduction and consciousness, but intuitively. Let the images form in your mind's eye and attend to them as you hear the other person's words. And then share the image. Now, if you haven't done this, it becomes quite uncomfortable and sometimes anxiety-producing to do this. But once you do it and you see the response, it's you'll be hooked. So you want to do more of it. Now, how do you share the image? It is important how you share the image, because you want to do it again in a way that stimulates an inner search and is not directive and doesn't choose for the client what it is they should be attending to. I like this aspect of the work because it is a way that we can introduce new ideas and information, yet still not be intrusive into the client's experience, which is just one of the characteristics of this approach and mirrored in the mutual respect that we talked about in psychology. So one of the ways to do that is to say, when you say that, I get the image of, you just describe the image. When you say that, I hear you, and this is what happens. I get this image. And then you ask, how does that fit with yours? What do you think of that? Now, very often the person will say, well, I see it over this way. Well, that's great. And then you can reflect that back and go back into it. It helps the person explore if you share it this way. If you ask them, well, is it like this? And you describe your image, then you're not doing it. Because then they're answering the question in terms of what you said. And they're saying, let's see, what's their inner process? Okay? They have to think about your image and say, is it like this? No. So it's much better to just share it. Because then you're sharing your experience and taking responsibility for that. You're not imposing it. If there's countertransference, then it's countertransference. And the other person's free to reject it or accept it. Connect it. Choose an image that feels empathically attuned to the client's message. It seems clear. You don't want to choose one that's not. That's another aspect of this work. As you do it, your clients will teach you which ones are more or less in tune as you continue to do this work and by seeing what the response is. Yeah.
Always to Mr. Sutton's point. When you say, when you say this, I get the image of, how does that fit with your image? That's okay, but to say, is it like that, is not okay. What's the difference?
The difference lies in the specificity of it. But I'm glad you raised the point, because I think the distinction doesn't lie in what I said, but it's something I was thinking about that didn't say. In an example that occurred about a week ago, when in the example where the client or the person who's role-playing the client said that I'm in a castle, or that there's a castle around. If the therapist had said, when you say castle, I get an image of the a moat. Is that, how's that for you? That would have been okay. It's not the greatest. I mean, it's a lot better to say, describe the castle. But what she said was, is there a moat around the castle? Now the person has to think, well, let's see. I wasn't thinking about moats before you mentioned it, but let me see if there's a moat around the castle. So that's where the difference, lies. If the therapist has said, when you say castle, I see a moat. What do you see? How does that fit with you? Then the client will go back into their own image and say, well, no, I don't. I see this. Still better is just to help the client explore their own image. So there are times when sharing the image is important, but always just sharing it. Let's do some skill training. And this method is called clustering. In looking for ways to teach this, and there are two ways to do this, and I'll tell you how he describes it in creative writing, and then how we'll adapt it, and then I'll ask you to do it. In creative writing, you take an idea that you want to write about, some phrase, some idea, you write it. And then you can think of this as a free association on a page. Then you begin to just associate, letting your mind wander and just associate to different ideas. And let's say you get a string of ideas, and you get the first idea, and then that leads to another idea, and that leads to another idea, and then this one leads to two other ideas, and then that's it. And then you start another string, where you associate another idea, and what you're writing here is a word or phrase that captures the idea, but you're doing it very rapidly. That's one of the characteristics of this. You're doing it very fast. You're not thinking about it. You're just doing very fast the first things that come to mind. Okay? Now, what you do when you're done in creative writing is you look at the overall pattern of what are the themes that you generate, what is the pattern that you have, and then you start to write. I find this really useful in writing poetry. You want to write poetry around the topic. It's a wonderful way to start. It's sometimes really useful in other ways too, when you're blocked in a process where logic is getting you stuck. This is a way of opening up different possibilities and seeing different possibilities. Now, what way we'll adapt that today in terms of training in metaphorical therapy is I would like you to take out a sheet of paper or turn over one of the sheets that you have that are part of your handout. And in the middle, I'd like you to write a metaphor. Preferably a metaphor that one of your clients used. If not, a metaphor that you use. And just write that metaphor. And now, with the first thing that comes to your mind and writing as rapidly as you can, I want you to associate to that metaphor. Whatever comes to mind. It can be a word, it can be an image, just write it down real fast, go on to the next one. And I'll give you 30 seconds to do that. So, real fast, just write. Okay, now take a look at the pattern, the overall pattern. And Let's see, who'd be willing to share theirs so we can, yes.
And I had a client who said to me the other day, I'm on a pedestal.
Okay. Wait a minute. I'm on a pedestal.
Right.
I'm on a, how do you spell pedestal? Pedestal, P-E-D period. Hear that? Okay, and your associations?
I've got lonely,
Lonely, Leading.
high up, superior, in control, not with the crowd, can't join in,
all these connected?
yeah,
Not
can't,
with,
can't
not
be
with,
like others,
not with the crowd, can't join in.
can't be like others.
Okay. Any other strings? Okay, good. Oh, we've got some help here. Falling off. Right, that means associate. So lonely, superior, in control, other hand can't join, and can't be like others. I'm on a pedestal. All of these associations. Now, one of the things that I think in working, not in the metaphorical domain, but working in the usual Adlerian domain, this can be really helpful to you. And maybe you can see why. Why would this be helpful in formulating some ideas about what lifestyle is about? Basic mistakes, and these possibilities, and then you can begin to see patterns and how they connect. Now what I'd like you to do is something a little different. Okay? I'd like you to get another blank sheet of paper, and I want you to write the same metaphor in this little box. And this time I want you to do clustering, but only in images. So what I want you to do is to visualize, form an image in your mind of the metaphor that you've written, and put yourself in it. And then associate to what you see and other things that you would associate visually, tactily, any kind of imagery to that metaphor. And again, do it as fast as you can. Okay, start. Okay, stop. Somebody's example? Yes.
Happy as a lark.
Happy as a lark is the metaphor?
Yes.
Okay,
Okay, I see myself sitting on a wire and looking down.
good.
Fun flying through the air and free and above everything. And I can look down again. Warm day. Feel happy and singing a song. And I first of all put a pretty song, beautiful song. It has to sound really good. Fly many places.
Okay, sound nice. Compare that to the other one.
Just about the same.
Some of my students have found that they actually give this exercise to their clients. Have the clients do this. And not just around metaphors, but ask them to cluster around different situations to open up immediate possibilities and break through the logical process. My focus today, and that's certainly possible, my focus today is that this is one of the ways that you can practice thinking in imagery. And what will happen if you practice it enough is that if it is not quite natural to you at the beginning, you will find that when a person speaks and speaks an image to you, you will formulate images. And even when they are not speaking in images, you can learn to listen and, quote, tune in to that channel of imagery in contrast to meaning or concept. That's what at least a lot of my students describe when they do this exercise, that a lot of there's more conceptual things in the first cluster than there are imaginal things. And in the cognitive literature, that's called descriptive versus depictive cognition. Imagery depicts things, doesn't describe them. That's why it's more immediate. That's why you have more sensual kind of sense. Because it depicts them directly rather than describes them indirectly. The conceptual process, the more syllogistic, propositional, is a more descriptive language, whereas the visual is a more depictive language. So when you just cluster, although clustering itself, and you're doing it very rapidly, taps more into a free associative kind of process, so it draws for that. So clustering itself tends to shift over to these more sensual, imaginal processes. But if you compare that, for example, to thinking about trying to understand what the person is saying, that's a different kind of process. Both are valuable. My goal is to have you, would be to have you be kind of equally facile in both, so that you can move in and out. Okay, I want to describe briefly drawing on the right side of the brain, which is another approach that I use in terms of training. The book undoubtedly is available up here. I think the first edition is out of print, so it's the second edition that you want. Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, second edition. In the second edition, Betty Edwards identifies 5 perceptual skills, what I described it, and creates different exercises for you to develop those perceptual skills. They involve things like seeing boundaries between shapes, seeing shades of light, and creating shades of light, seeing depth perception. She identifies these different ones. And the methods, what she calls the left, there's a left mode and a right mode of seeing and of processing and of perception. And it basically roughly correlates with Sperry's work on left-right hemisphere and other work that's been done in that area, where the left hemisphere is primarily logical and analytical, and the right hemisphere is more visual and holistic, visuospatial. And the goal is to trick the left hemisphere into getting out of the way so that the right hemisphere can do the drawing and control the movements of the hand, rather than the knowledge and the idea of, I am drawing a face. That's when you get in trouble. If you just draw what you see, then what you see goes onto the canvas or the paper. But if you're drawing a face, then what you try to do is draw your idea of a face, and you're not drawing what you see. Well, that kind of skill is very useful in therapy in general, but certainly in this form of therapy, it's quite essential. And Dreikers had the ability to do that, among other things. And he could see a person, the way a person walked, and tell you about their lifestyle and their family history. But the other people looking at it didn't see the way he saw. Many times, I guess you guys mostly have an experience. How many of you knew Dreikers or saw him personally? Yeah, another generation. But he used to get so exasperated when he would see the essence of a lifestyle and ask, in class, well, what is it? Or what's a person's basic mistake? Or whatever the question was, they couldn't get it. And he'd say, no, she saw it, she said it. Why can't they hear it? He'd get so frustrated. But he did see in a different way. And the way he saw was directly. And I believe that drawing on the right side of the brain trains you to see in that way. I think it's really helpful and really useful. And it also helps you draw a heck of a lot better, much better than you ever thought you could. Really wonderful. In addition to using metaphors, we also want to focus on an understanding of the metaphors and the images, and that's the Adlerian stuff. And what is the movement in the metaphor? And what is the goal of the movement? I had a student who, her first foray into metaphorical intervention was with a client she would describe as resistant. And he at one point in the session said he had been talking about change and feeling like he wants to change but he's not able to, and he gave several examples as he spoke. At one point he said, I feel as if I have painted myself into a corner. Good old metaphor. So what she said was, how would you get out of the corner? He said, well, I didn't mean that literally. I just feel as if. And then she went on to something else, reporting in class the following week that she tried metaphor and it didn't work. Well, take a look at what she tried and why it didn't work. He came up with a wonderful metaphor. And she made an assumption about it. She assumed that being painted in a corner is something that you don't want to do. And he was implying that in the metaphor. But his real movement, in terms of his behavior, was he's staying in the corner. He says he doesn't know how to get out. He's making the choice to not get out, of course. But he's saying he doesn't know how to get out. By asking, how would you get out of the corner, she was violating his movement. And she created the resistance by saying that, because her goals and movement were not aligned with his. Okay, so understanding the movement in the metaphor is really important. Because if she had said, as I suggested to her, in terms of painting, what's it like to be painted into a corner, you avoid that problem. It's your experience of it. If you said, so you were painting, what were you painting? A little room? Or where does this paint job take place? I'd be curious. What's the rest of the image? And if she asked if you could change the image, how would you change it? The person might say, well, I'd like to change it, but I don't know how. I like to get out of the corner. And then I would probably say something like, well, paint takes a while to dry. So while it's drying, how can we make you more comfortable in the corner? Now, I then am doing, again, Adlerian therapy of aligning my movement of the goals of the client through the metaphor. You see that? And because the painting oneself into a corner is an image, metaphorical image for a situation that is a problem, then I also am, although I'm not talking about the situation, I am talking about the situation. And I am aligning with that person around that. It's really nice when it's working well. The second is when you're listening to the person not describe a metaphor that they're exploring, but just describing anything. Any situation, any behavior, any feeling, any thought, any belief, listen to the images. Now, if your clients allow you to tape them, it's a wonderful way for you to learn this process, because it's a lot easier to do it when you listen to the tape than when you're in the session. A little further on, I have some examples, and there are others, of blocks to learning this process. And one of them is that the person is going to say something and want you to respond to it while you're doing this work. And what are they going to do? Some people are very nervous about that. They say, well, if I tend to the metaphors, then they might say, well, what about my mother? And what? I was thinking about your mother. And if you're looking inward to your own imagery, it might be weird for the other person. I don't think so, and I'm a little weird anyway as a therapist, so sometimes my clients say, what are you doing? I'm attending to my own imagery. Describe what it is going on. In an example that occurred about a week ago. When in the example where the client or the person who's role-playing the client said that I'm in a castle, or that there's a castle around. If the therapist had said, when you say castle, I get an image of the a moat. Is that, how's that for you? That would have been okay. It's not the greatest. I mean, it's a lot better to say, describe the castle. But what she said was, is there a moat around the castle? Now the person has to think, well, let's see. I wasn't thinking about moats before you mentioned it, but let me see if there's a moat around the castle. So that's where the difference, lies. If the therapist has said, when you say castle, I see a moat. What do you see? How does that fit with you? Then the client will go back into their own image and say, well, no, I don't. I see this. Still better is just to help the client explore their own image. So there are times when sharing the image is important, but always just sharing it. But thanks. I like this aspect of the work because it is a way that we can introduce new ideas and information, yet still not be intrusive into the client's experience, which is just one of the characteristics of this approach and mirrored in the mutual respect that we talk about in psychology. So one of the ways to do that is to say, when you say that, I get the image of, you just describe the image. When you say that, I hear you, and this is what happens. I get this image. And then you ask, how does that fit with yours? What do you think of that? Now, very often the person will say, well, I see it over this way. Well, that's great. And then you can reflect that back and go back into it. It helps the person explore if you share it this way. If you ask them, well, is it like this, and you describe your image, then you're not doing it. Because then they're answering the question in terms of what you said. And they're saying, let's see, what's their inner process? Okay? They have to think about your image and say, is it like this? No. So it's much better to just share it. Because then you're sharing your experience and taking responsibility for that. You're not imposing it. If there's countertransference, then it's countertransference. And the other person's free to reject it or accept it. Choose an image that feels empathically attuned to the client's message. It seems clear. You don't want to choose one that's not. That's another aspect of this work. As you do it, your clients will teach you which ones are more or less you doing as you continue to do this work, and by seeing what their response is. So that's an example of the importance of understanding the movement in a metaphor and the goal in responding. If you stick to the neutrality, and there's a neutrality to these interventions of just asking what's your experience, etc., then you don't have this problem. But as therapists, we also want to do other kinds of things, and if we do other kinds of things, it is absolutely essential that we understand the nature of the movement. And one of the things that metaphors can be conceptualized from many different points of view, as we've articulated here, but Adlerian psychology is a natural for the metaphor in terms of looking at movement and looking at goals and working